The gates were locked, but the lights were still on. Inside the mansion, water dripped from a ceiling that had cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Somewhere in the back wing, an alarm chirped endlessly, unanswered. The house wasn't abandoned yet. It was simply no longer obeying the people who owned it. This wasn't a single bad night. It was the third contractor to walk away that year. The second security system that failed without explanation. Another room sealed off because the floor could no longer support the weight it was designed for. Repairs were no longer fixing anything. They were slowing an outcome everyone could feel approaching. Staff learned quickly which doors no longer closed properly, which hallways echoed because the furniture had been removed to protect it, which rooms were never used, not because they weren't beautiful, but because opening them created problems no one wanted to document. The mansion was still standing, but it had begun to behave like a liability instead of a symbol. What made this harder to explain was the money. There was no shortage of it, not in theory, not on paper. The family behind the house had built the largest retail empire in modern history. Their name was synonymous with efficiency, logistics, scale. Entire towns functioned around their stores, supply chains bent to their system. Billions moved quietly under their control every day. And yet, this house refused to stay solved. Maintenance reports stopped using optimistic language. Words like temporary disappeared. Costs were no longer itemized, only summarized. The estate consumed attention without producing anything in return. No leverage, no visibility, no narrative benefit, just expense and friction. This wasn't what the property was supposed to do. The mansion had been conceived as permanence, not a vacation home, not an investment flip, but an anchor. Something that would still exist when quarterly earnings were forgotten. A structure meant to hold legacy, not just wealth. Instead, it became a place where problems accumulated quietly, out of view, until they demanded response. Visitors sensed it immediately. The scale impressed them, but the atmosphere unsettled them. Too many rooms with no clear purpose. Too much space designed for gatherings that never happened. The kind of silence that feels procedural, not peaceful. People stayed polite. They did not stay long. The irony wasn't lost on those close to the family. The fortune that had reshaped American consumption struggled to justify a single address. Walmart had been built on the principle of reducing excess. Smaller margins, tighter inventory, relentless cost control. Sam Walton famously lived modestly even after success, driving his old pickup truck long after he could afford anything else. This house did the opposite of that philosophy, and that was the problem. The heirs inherited more than money. They inherited an expectation of continuity. Sam Walton's children, Rob, John, Jim, and Alice, grew up watching an enterprise expand without appearing fragile. But expansion and endurance are not the same thing. A company can absorb mistakes. A house cannot, especially not one designed to impress rather than adapt. As years passed, the mansion stopped being discussed openly. It appeared less frequently in family planning conversation. Lawyers referenced it carefully. Accountants categorized it differently than other assets. It was no longer about what it represented, but how quietly it could be managed without drawing attention. Because attention invited questions. Why did a family known for operational discipline allow a property to drift like this? Why commit to a structure that resisted efficiency at every level? Why hold on to something that produced neither profit nor peace? The answers were never written down. What was clear is that the mansion was built to solve something emotional, not logistical. It was designed to stay when everything else changed. But permanence is expensive, and legacy does not generate cash flow. The house did not fail suddenly. It failed gradually, through friction, through decisions postponed, through maintenance deferred, because no one wanted to admit the original miscalculation. By the time the problems were undeniable, the mansion had already shifted role. It was no longer a home. It was evidence. Evidence that even the most successful fortunes can misread what should last. Evidence that scale in one domain does not translate to another. Evidence that money can build almost anything, except inevitability. And this wasn't the end of the story. It was the surface crack. Because the real cost of the mansion wasn't what it consumed, It was what it exposed about the family's relationship with permanence, control, and identity. The structure didn't just age, it revealed a decision that had been flawed from the moment it was made. The mistake didn't start with decay, it started with confidence. The house existed because saying no would have been harder. By the time the decision was made, the fortune already felt abstract. The Walmart empire no longer moved through hands. It moved through structure, trust, boards, layers of professionals whose job was to turn volatility into predictability. The heirs didn't manage stores. They managed consequences. And still, the mansion slipped through. It didn't begin as extravagant. It began as justification. A physical answer to a question no one wanted to ask directly. What does permanence look like when everything else scales faster than identity? For Sam Walton, permanence had been simple. Bentonville, a modest home. Visibility. His power came from proximity, from understanding the floor, the shelf, the customer. He distrusted displays of wealth because they distorted feedback. But the next generation didn't inherit proximity, inherited distance. Rob Walton would eventually become chairman, overseeing Walmart's explosive global expansion. Jim Walton focused on banking and financial institutions tied to the family. Alice Walton moved furthest from the operational core, channeling wealth into art, land, and personal projects that resisted measurement. Together, they controlled a fortune that grew even when they disagreed. The mansion was born in that space. It was not a rebellion against Sam Walton's values. It was a reinterpretation, a belief that legacy required something visible, something immovable, a structure that could not be liquidated with a signature, something that would still exist if strategies changed, markets collapsed, or public narratives turned hostile. But the house didn't behave like a symbol. It behaved like a system. Every year it demanded attention, staffing, security, insurance, renovation cycles that never ended because the original scale created its own entropy. The larger the rooms, the faster they aged. The more land involved, the harder it became to monitor without constant presence. This wasn't inefficiency in theory. It was inefficiency in motion. Executives within Walmart would have flagged a project like this immediately. Too much overhead, too little return, no clear path to optimization. But families don't run like corporations, and this decision lived outside any quarterly logic. No one was responsible for maximizing it. No one was rewarded for challenging it. So the problems accumulated silently. There were attempts to repurpose it, hosting, private events, quiet philanthropic functions designed to justify the expense without turning it into a spectacle. None worked long-term. The house resisted redefinition. It was too personal to become public, too expensive to remain private without friction. The deeper issue was psychological. The mansion wasn't just property. It was an answer to the fear that everything else could disappear. Walmart's dominance depended on consumer behavior, labor tolerance, regulatory patience. The family knew, better than most, how quickly narratives could shift. A physical estate felt immune to that. It wasn't. What began as assurance slowly turned into exposure. The house became a point of contrast, a reminder that while Walmart emphasized low prices and operational discipline, its wealth could still produce excess that felt disconnected from its public image. Quietly, advisors began to treat the mansion not as an asset, but as a risk surface. Risk didn't arrive dramatically. It arrived through inconvenience. Neighbors complained. Zoning issues multiplied. Environmental regulations complicated land management. Each solution created a new dependency. Each fix required another specialist. The house no longer represented control. It represented coordination failure. And yet, letting go felt worse. Selling would create headlines. Donating would invite scrutiny. Repurposing would raise questions about motive. The safest option was inertia. Keep it. Maintain it just enough. Avoid visibility. Let time blur its significance. But time doesn't erase cost. It compounds it. The Walton fortune had always been exceptional, not just for its size, but for its restraint. Even as family members ranked among the wealthiest individuals on the planet, public perception remained surprisingly muted. That balance was fragile. The mansion threatened it simply by existing. This wasn't a scandal. There were no crimes, no lawsuits, no collapse. That was the problem. Without crisis, there was no justification for decisive action. The house lingered in a state worse than failure, unresolved ownership. Internally, it became shorthand, not spoken about directly, but referenced through pauses, through phrases like, "that property," or "the long-term situation." Everyone understood what it meant, a decision that had outlived its rationale. The house didn't challenge the family's wealth. It challenged their narrative of control. And narratives matter more than assets. Because Walmart's true power was never just retail. It was the story of discipline, of margins won through restraint. The mansion contradicted that story quietly, persistently, simply by standing there. By the time anyone acknowledged that, the structure had already done its damage. Not financially. The fortune could absorb that easily, but symbolically. It exposed the difference between building an empire and knowing how to stop building. The mistake wasn't excess, it was permanence without purpose. And the longer the house stood unresolved, the clearer it became that this was not a temporary misstep. It was a slow lesson unfolding in real time, one that couldn't be spun away or optimized out. The fortune stayed, the confidence didn't. The problem with enormous systems is that they convince you they are immune to small failures. Walmart grew by mastering repetition. One store became 10, 10 became hundreds, hundreds became everywhere. The company learned early that if something worked at scale, individual flaws disappeared inside volume. A bad location could be offset. A failed product could be replaced. Losses were absorbed and redistributed until they barely registered. The mansion was not built to be absorbed. It stood alone, demanding attention in a way no store ever could. There was no replication, no learning curve. Every mistake was permanent. Every inefficiency was magnified by its unique. It could not hide inside a spreadsheet the way a regional underperformer could, and that made it dangerous. As Walmart expanded globally through the 1990s and 2000s, the Walton family's wealth multiplied faster than their visibility. Trust structures protected ownership. Voting power was consolidated. The company evolved from a founder-driven culture into an institution with momentum of its own. By the time Sam Walton's influence became purely symbolic, the machine no longer needed guidance to grow. The mansion, however, needed guidance constantly. It required decisions that no governance structure had prepared anyone to make. Who gets access? Who carries responsibility? Is this a family space, a corporate symbol, or something else entirely? Each answer produced friction. Each non-answer produced drift. People assumed money would solve this. It didn't. Money removed urgency, not complexity. Because nothing forced resolution, the estate settled into a gray zone where everyone was involved and no one was accountable. This is where large fortunes quietly lose control, not through collapse, but through diffusion. Even within the Walton family, priorities diverge. Alice Walton invested heavily in art, eventually founding Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas, a public institution designed to democratize access to American art. That project had mission clarity. It transformed private wealth into public legacy. The mansion had no such conversion. Rob Walton maintained a low profile, focusing on continuity and governance. Jim Walton reinforced financial infrastructure. These were controlled, scalable arenas. The house was not. It resisted translation into purpose. And so it began to mirror a problem Walmart itself had always tried to avoid: complexity without efficiency. Externally, pressure mounted in subtle ways. The family's public image had long depended on a contrast: massive wealth paired with modest behavior. Sam Walton's old pickup truck became legend for a reason. It reassured customers that the people behind the brand understood restraint. The mansion disrupted that narrative simply by existing, not loudly, quietly. It didn't appear on postcards. It wasn't marketed, but information leaks. Contractors talk, locals notice, stories circulate, and every story reframes perception just a little. Not enough to cause backlash, enough to create distance. Distance is expensive. The irony was that Walmart had become so large it could weather almost any public criticism. Labor disputes, antitrust scrutiny, supply chain controversies, the company endured them all. But the family understood something outsiders often miss. Reputational erosion doesn't come from scandals alone. It comes from contradiction. A single mansion could contradict decades of brand discipline. That realization changed how the property was treated. Not resolved, managed. The goal shifted from justification to containment. Reduce exposure, minimize narrative risk, ensure the house did not become symbolic of something larger. This created its own problem. Containment requires maintenance. Maintenance requires money and oversight. Oversight creates records. Records invite questions. Every attempt to quiet the mansion increased the infrastructure around it, making it harder to ignore. The house had become what Walmart's systems were designed to eliminate, friction that scaled upward instead of flattening out. Meanwhile, the fortune continued growing. Walmart's market capitalization crossed thresholds that would have been unimaginable during Sam Walton's lifetime. The family remained among the wealthiest in the world, their influence extending into finance, politics, philanthropy, and culture. And still, the mansion refused to disappear into irrelevance. It aged. Materials deteriorated. Design choices that once felt timeless began to feel dated. Restoration costs increased, not because of neglect, but because of ambition embedded in the original build. Grandeur is expensive to preserve because it was never meant to be efficient. At some point, someone close to the situation articulated the uncomfortable truth. The house no longer represented success. It represented an unresolved decision. That was the moment scale stopped protecting them. Because when something cannot be optimized, delegated, or absorbed, it forces a confrontation with intent. Why does this exist? What problem was it meant to solve? And why is it still here? No one had a clean answer. The Walton fortune was built on answering those questions faster than competitors. The mansion lingered precisely because those questions were emotionally loaded rather than strategic. It wasn't a business failure, it was a philosophical one. And philosophical failures don't announce themselves. They surface slowly, through discomfort, through avoidance, through the quiet recognition that something built to last no longer fits the system that sustains it. The house didn't collapse. It waited. And waiting for something this large is never neutral. Indecision has a shape. In this case, it was measured in unused rooms, locked wings, and conversations that ended without conclusion. The mansion entered a phase that no one had planned for. Extended limbo. Not decline, not renewal, but suspension. It existed in calendars as a recurring obligation and in budgets as a line item no one wanted to explain twice. It was too large to ignore and too awkward to confront directly. This is where costs become psychological. Financially, the Walton family could absorb anything the house demanded. That was never the threat. The danger was subtler. The longer the mansion remained unresolved, the more it demanded interpretation. Every year it stayed untouched. It became less a symbol of foresight and more a monument to hesitation. Inside the family's broader ecosystem, clarity was everything. Walmart thrived because decisions were made early and corrected quickly. Stores were closed when they failed. Strategies were abandoned when data shifted. Emotional attachment was minimized in favor of scale and efficiency. The mansion resisted that logic completely. Selling it would feel like admitting error. Transforming it would invite questions about motive. Preserving it indefinitely created a slow bleed of attention. Each option carried reputational implications, and reputational risk was one of the few things the family treated with genuine caution. So they waited. Waiting created new problems. Staff turnover meant institutional knowledge disappeared. Why certain design decisions had been made? Why specific systems existed? What compromises had already failed? All of that faded. Each new consultant had to relearn the property from scratch, repeating mistakes without realizing they were repeats. Time compounded inefficiency. Meanwhile, the world outside changed faster than the house could keep up with. Expectations around wealth shifted. Transparency became unavoidable. The optics of unused luxury hardened. What once read as privacy began to read as detachment. This was especially uncomfortable given Walmart's public positioning. The company faced ongoing criticism over wages, labor practices, and its impact on small businesses. The family navigated these debates carefully, emphasizing philanthropy, community investment, and long-term economic contribution. An unresolved mansion complicated that message, not because it was extravagant, but because it was inert. It didn't give back. It didn't educate. It didn't integrate. It simply existed, consuming resources while producing nothing visible. Alice Walton's Crystal Bridges stood in stark contrast. That project transformed private collecting into public good. It anchored cultural value in a physical space with purpose. It justified scale through access. The mansion had no such translation. Internally, comparisons were inevitable. One structure extended legacy outward. The other folded it inward. One invited public participation. The other required insulation. This tension mattered more than outsiders realized. For families of this magnitude, legacy is not abstract. It is actively managed. Every major asset is evaluated not just for return, but for narrative alignment. What does this say about us? What does this teach future generations? The mansion stopped answering those questions cleanly. At some point, advisors reframed the issue, not as a property problem, but as a decision problem. The house wasn't expensive because of maintenance. It was expensive because it forced continual avoidance. Each year, it remained unresolved. It extracted cognitive bandwidth from people whose primary skill was clarity. That realization didn't produce action immediately, but it changed tone. The mansion stopped being discussed as something to preserve. It became something to neutralize. That didn't mean demolition or sale. It meant stripping it of symbolic weight, reducing its emotional footprint, making it smaller in the family's internal mythology, even if its physical scale stayed the same. That process was slow and imperfect. The hardest part was admitting that the original intention no longer mattered. Whatever the mansion had been meant to represent, stability, permanence, identity, it no longer fulfilled that role. Holding on to the intention only prolonged the mismatch. Large fortunes struggle with this more than most. When resources are unlimited, correction feels optional, but optional corrections accumulate until they become structural. The mansion revealed that paradox clearly. Wealth delayed consequences, but it did not remove them. It simply spread them across time, where they became harder to isolate and easier to rationalize. Eventually, the question shifted again. Not, what should we do with it, but why are we still carrying this? That was the most dangerous question of all, because it implied sunk cost fallacy. It suggested that past investment was dictating present behavior. Walmart's rise had been built on rejecting exactly that thinking. You don't keep a failing store because you've already built it. You close it. But families are not companies, and houses are not stores. The mansion sat at that uncomfortable intersection, forcing a confrontation between operational logic and emotional residue. The longer it remained, the more obvious the contradiction became. It was no longer about money. It was about whether a family known for decisiveness could admit that one decision had quietly outlived its usefulness, and whether letting go would cost more, financially, reputationally, psychologically, than continuing to pretend that time alone would solve it. By now, the house wasn't just waiting, it was asking. The mansion survived because no one wanted to be the person who ended it. That hesitation revealed something uncomfortable about legacy at extreme scale. When wealth becomes generational, decisions stop being evaluated only for impact and start being weighed for symbolism. Ending something can feel more dangerous than sustaining it, even when sustaining it no longer makes sense. The Walton family understood legacy better than most. Sam Walton's philosophy had been institutionalized long before his death. Frugality wasn't just personal preference, it became cultural signaling. Stories about his modest house in Bentonville and his refusal to indulge were repeated until they hardened into doctrine. The brand absorbed that narrative and benefited from it for decades. The mansion sat outside that doctrine. It didn't violate it openly. It simply failed to reinforce it. That made it harder to classify. It wasn't a scandal, so it didn't demand apology. It wasn't productive, so it didn't justify celebration. It existed in a narrow zone where the only real outcome was discomfort. This created a generational disconnect. For younger members of the family, the mansion felt inherited without consent. It was a responsibility passed down without context, a physical artifact of a decision they hadn't made but were expected to manage. That kind of inheritance carries a unique weight. You're not honoring a vision, you're maintaining residue, and residue resists reinterpretation. Attempts were made to frame the mansion as historical, as private heritage, as something to be preserved quietly until it made sense again. But history without narrative fades. Heritage without access stagnates. Over time, the mansion lost even internal champions. What replaced them were caretakers. Caretakers don't decide futures. They prevent collapse. That distinction mattered. The house stopped evolving. It entered preservation mode without being officially preserved. No restoration vision. No adaptive reuse strategy. Just enough investment to prevent irreversible damage. Enough to keep options open while never choosing one. Options, like wealth, feel empowering until they paralyze. Meanwhile, the external world continued reshaping expectations around billionaires and inheritance. Wealth concentration became a public debate. Philanthropy shifted from charity to impact metric. Institutions were expected to justify not just their existence, but their opportunity cost. A mansion with no public interface struggled in that climate. It wasn't that anyone demanded its removal. It simply failed to align with a world that increasingly asked, "What does this do?" Not symbolically, functionally. The family's other assets had answered. Businesses employed people. Foundations funded programs. Museums educated visitors. Even passive investments could be explained in terms of economic activity. The mansion's explanation always circled back to the same point. It exists because it exists. That answer doesn't scale. Internally, this became a lesson in negative space. The absence of purpose became more instructive than any success. The house demonstrated how easily permanence could turn into inertia when insulated from consequence. There was no dramatic turning point, no crisis forced resolution. Instead, the mansion slowly lost its status as a meaningful object. It became background, something referenced occasionally, like an old policy no one remembered implement that might have been acceptable if it truly faded, but it didn't. Physical structures demand engagement. Deferred decisions surface as maintenance emergency. Neglected clarity becomes operational noise. Every year, something needed attention. Every year, someone had to ask, "What are we doing with this?" And every year, the answer was deferred. This cycle revealed a truth that cut against the mythology of infinite resources. Wealth can buy time, but it cannot eliminate the need to choose. Delayed choices don't disappear. They age. The mansion aged into contradiction. It stood as proof that legacy is not preserved by holding on, but by translating value forward. Sam Walton's legacy endured because it evolved into systems others could operate. The mansion had no such transfer mechanism. It couldn't teach. It couldn't scale. It couldn't adapt without redefining itself entirely. That made it fragile in a way money couldn't fix. Eventually, the house stopped being about the past and started threatening the future, not through cost, but through example. What message did it send to the next generation? That unresolved decisions could be maintained indefinitely? That clarity was optional when wealth was sufficient? That was not a lesson anyone wanted to pass down. And so, quietly, without announcement, the mansion's status shifted again. It was no longer preserved for what it was meant to represent. It was preserved until it could be undone safely, not destroyed, released. But release requires timing. And timing requires admitting that the original intent has expired. The hardest part of legacy isn't building something that lasts, it's knowing when to stop carrying it. By the time that realization settled in, the mansion had already served its final purpose. It had shown, through its own persistence, the cost of confusing permanence with meaning. The fortune endured. The house no longer knew why it was there. Exit strategies are easy when something fails loudly. This didn't. The mansion never collapsed, never triggered outrage, never crossed a threshold that forced public reckoning. Instead, it became something far more difficult to resolve, a non-event that consumed effort simply by continuing to exist. For families accustomed to decisive leverage, This was unfamiliar terrain. The shift began not with action, but with language. Internally, the mansion stopped being referred to as legacy. It became transitional. Then, under evaluation. Then, eventually, nothing at all. Silence replaced debate. Not because consensus had been reached, but because repetition had exhausted conviction. When something no longer inspires defense, it has already lost. This is how exits begin at the highest levels, not with announcements, but with disengagement. No new meaning was attached to the property. No future was articulated for it. It was maintained at arm's length, stripped of emotional urgency. The goal wasn't to save it or showcase it. The goal was to reduce its gravitational pull until letting go felt inevitable rather than dramatic. That approach mirrored Walmart's most disciplined instinct: starve inefficiency of attention until it resolves itself. But unlike a retail location, the mansion could not be closed overnight. It required sequencing. Legal structures had to align. Reputational exposure had to be minimized. Any transition needed to feel organic, not corrective. Correction implies error, and error, at this level, is managed carefully. The family had learned over decades how to move assets quietly. Entire portfolios shifted without headlines. Control was exercised through patience rather than force. The mansion would be handled the same way. What complicated this was memory. Even when emotional attachment fades, symbolic residue remains. Someone always remembers why a decision was made, even if they no longer agree with it. That memory resists abrupt ending. It demands dignity, even when relevance is gone. So the strategy became containment plus optionality. Keep the structure intact. Limit discussion. Avoid public framing. Let the mansion age into neutrality rather than controversy. Neutrality in this context was success. The irony is that this approach mirrored how Walmart itself neutralized competition, not through confrontation, but through endurance. Outlast, outscale, outweight. Let pressure dissipate. Here, the pressure was internal. As years passed, the mansion's role diminished further. It stopped appearing in long-term planning documents. It was excluded from generational discussions about values and future stewardship. When younger family members spoke about legacy, they referenced institutions, not places. That absence mattered. Legacy, once untethered from a physical anchor, became more flexible. It could adapt. The mansion, meanwhile, remained rigid, defined by its original purpose, even after that purpose dissolved. This asymmetry sealed its fate. Nothing dramatic happened. No sale announcement, no donation gala, no redevelopment press release. The exit strategy was designed to feel like inevitability, not choice. When the transition eventually occurred, it would register as closure rather than loss. That distinction was crucial because closure suggests completion. Loss suggests regret. The Walton family had spent decades refining how to complete chapters without inviting reinterpretation. The mansion was simply a late chapter that resisted ending on its own. Behind the scenes, conversations shifted toward timing rather than justification. Not, should this continue, but when does this stop making sense to carry? The answer was no longer emotional. It was logistical. And logistics always win. The mansion had outlived its symbolic usefulness. It no longer anchored identity. It no longer protected against uncertainty. The world it had been built for no longer existed, replaced by structures that required agility rather than monumentality. That realization didn't feel like defeat. It felt like alignment. The family that had built an empire by understanding when to expand also understood when to retract. The same discipline that opened thousands of stores could quietly close one chapter without spectacle. By the time the decision was effectively made, nothing outward had changed. The house still stood. The grounds were still maintained, but internally, the mansion was already gone. What remained was process. Process would take time. It always does when done carefully. But the emotional work was complete. The hardest part, admitting that the structure no longer belonged to the future, had already happened. That is why the exit felt quiet. No one mourned. No one defended. No one argued. The mansion had served its unintended purpose. It had exposed the limits of permanence. Even under extreme wealth, It had shown that legacy without adaptability becomes weight, not foundation. When the house finally transitioned out of the family's direct orbit, it would not feel like abandonment. It would feel like release from maintenance, from narrative risk, from a decision that had been carried longer than it deserved. The fortune remained intact. The identity evolved. And somewhere in that shift was the final lesson the mansion offered, that power is not proven by what you keep, but by what you know how to let go of before it defines you. The house did not end the way it began. There was no dramatic failure, no visible collapse, no moment when the gates closed for the last time and someone noticed immediately. Instead, the mansion exited relevance the same way it had existed for years, quietly, administratively, without ceremony. By then, it no longer needed defending. What lingered was not regret, but clarity. The family didn't lose money on the house in any meaningful sense. Loss, in this context, wasn't financial. It was conceptual. The mansion represented a belief that permanence itself was value, that if something was large enough, expensive enough, solid enough, it could stabilize identity across generations. That belief didn't survive contact with time. Walmart's fortune endured precisely because it refused to anchor itself to immovable things. Stores changed, formats evolved, entire strategies were discarded when they no longer worked. The Walton family's control persisted because it adapted faster than its symbols. The mansion could not adapt. In the end, it stood as a contradiction to the very system that created the wealth behind it. A system optimized for flow had produced a structure that demanded stillness. A philosophy built on efficiency had tolerated inefficiency in the name of legacy. That tension was unsustainable. When the mansion finally transitioned out of the family's direct stewardship, it didn't feel like a failure. It felt like alignment restored. The house moved into a different context, one where its scale could be reinterpreted without distorting the family's narrative. The family moved on almost immediately. That, more than anything, revealed the truth. The mansion had never been central. It had been incidental, an experiment that lasted longer than intended because no one wanted to interrupt it. Once interrupted, it left very little behind. No mythology took hold. No defining story replaced it. The Walton legacy remained intact because it was never dependent on a single structure. It lived in governance models, voting trusts, philanthropic institutions, and a corporation that still dominated global retail decades after its founder's death. The house couldn't compete with that kind of continuity. What it did leave behind was a lesson rarely visible at this level of wealth. That scale magnifies mistakes as effectively as it magnifies success. The same resources that allow errors to persist indefinitely also ensure they become more revealing over time. The mansion revealed something subtle but important. Even families built on discipline can confuse permanence with security. Even fortunes designed to endure can misplace their confidence. Sam Walton's restraint had not been aesthetic. It had been strategic. He understood that wealth draws distortion, and that resisting that distortion required constant recalibration. His heirs inherited the systems he built, but not the conditions that shaped his instincts. The mansion emerged in that gap. It wasn't excess for excess's sake. It was an attempt to anchor meaning in something physical when everything else felt abstract. But abstraction was the very terrain Walmart had mastered. Trying to escape it produced friction instead of relief. In the final accounting, the mansion didn't damage the fortune. It clarified it. It demonstrated that legacy is not protected by monuments, but by decisions that remain correct as contexts change. Structures freeze intention. Systems evolve it. The fortune stayed because it moved. The house failed because it didn't. Years from now, few people will remember the details of the mansion. It will not appear in corporate histories or family biography. It will exist, at most, as a footnote, a place that once mattered because it was supposed to, and then, quietly, didn't. That outcome is more instructive than any scandal would have been. The most dangerous errors at this level are not the ones that explode. They are the ones that linger, unchallenged, protected by resources that make correction feel optional. The mansion was such an error, Not dramatic enough to demand action, not useful enough to justify itself. It simply waited. And waiting, as it turns out, was its final cost. Because while the house stood still, the world continued reshaping what wealth was expected to do. It demanded transparency, impact, motion. Anything static became suspect. Anything unexplained became fragile. The Walton fortune adapted. The mansion did not. In that difference lies the entire story. Not of extravagance, but of misalignment. Not of collapse, but of quiet correction. The house didn't fall. It was outgrown. And that is why it matters. Because the most powerful fortunes in history are not undone by loss. They are tested by excess that no longer fits. The ability to recognize that and to let go without spectacle is what allows them to endure. The gates were locked. The lights were off. Nothing dramatic marked the moment. The house simply stopped being necessary, and the fortune, as always, moved on without it.